Imagine someone who has, like, read every single book ever written about the ocean.
Right, just an absolute academic expert.
Exactly. I mean, they know the exact salinity of the water. They've studied the fluid dynamics of a wave. They can recite the biological makeup of a coral reef completely from memory.
Sure.
They are, by all standards, a total authority on the sea, but they have never, not even once, actually stepped off the dry land and put their bare foot in the water.
Yeah, which means they possess this flawless theoretical understanding, right? And it's incredibly safe.
Oh, totally safe.
It's perfectly controlled. But if you were to actually push that person into the deep end of the real ocean, with the currents pulling and the temperature dropping,
They drown.
yeah, they drown immediately.
Because, I mean, knowledge about the water isn't the same thing as knowing how to swim.
No, not at all.
The theory is perfectly clean, but the reality of the ocean is turbulent, it's unpredictable, and frankly, it's a little terrifying. And that massive gap, like the space between knowing the theory and actually surviving the practice, is exactly what we are dissecting today in this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a huge issue.
We are pulling apart a really fascinating manual on community engagement and human formation. And it asks this one, frankly, devastating question right from the jump.
And it's a question that stops you in your tracks.
It really does. It asks, what if your greatest limitation isn't a lack of passion, but a lack of practice?
Which, diagnoses a very specific kind of modern paralysis, regardless of your background.
Right. Now, just to be super clear with you about our mission for this deep dive, the source material we are exploring today is titled Evangelistic Outreach and Community Engagement.
Right.
And it is explicitly a theological and practical manual. It's designed for Christian church leaders.
It is deeply rooted in biblical text.
Exactly. But what we are going to do is extract the universally profound framework this author builds regarding apprenticeship, navigating cultural divides, and human transformation.
Because the mechanics are just remarkably robust.
They really are. So whether you are leading a corporate team or maybe trying to communicate a difficult message to a hostile audience, or you just want to move your own life from perpetually knowing into actually doing.
There's an absolute masterclass hidden in these pages.
Right. And just to set the parameters here, we are going to explore these religious and theological concepts exactly as they are presented in the text.
Yeah, we are going to impartially convey these ideas about faith, the gospel, and mission.
Right, without taking sides or endorsing the theology itself. The goal is simply to uncover the underlying psychological and sociological mechanics of how this text proposes transforming communities.
Which is where things get really interesting.
Okay, so let's unpack this core diagnosis. The author launches a devastating critique of modern learning and institutional formation.
Yeah, they really do not hold back.
No, they don't. The argument essentially claims that we have become incredibly capable thinkers, but totally hesitant practitioners.
Right, we are great at theory.
Exactly. We've mastered the art of gathering in these perfectly safe spaces,
Yeah.
classrooms, strategy meetings, seminars.
Sanctuaries.
Right, to analyze models and refine theories. But the moment we are required to step outside those walls into real uncertainty,
Everything stalls out.
it totally stalls out.
What's fascinating here is the specific metaphor the text uses to describe this institutional isolation. The author calls it the greenhouse problem.
The greenhouse problem. I love this analogy.
It's brilliant, right?
Well,
Because if you think about the function of a greenhouse, it's a hermetically sealed environment.
yeah.
You artificially control the temperature, you control the humidity, the light, and you do this to protect delicate, vulnerable plants from the harsh weather of the outside world.
Right, the wind, the sudden frost, the drought.
Exactly. It is highly effective for preserving something in a fragile, controlled state.
But I mean, plants are not meant to be raised forever under glass.
No, eventually they have to be strengthened so they can endure the open air.
And the argument here is that faith, or really any deeply held organizational value, has been preserved as this delicate museum piece behind sacred walls.
Rather than a living, breathing practice out in the elements.
And the practical examples they provide are incredibly cutting.
Oh yeah, very specific.
Like, they observe that institutions will spend weeks explaining the theology of prayer, but the people never actually pray together.
Right. Or they teach leadership from a podium using 12-point slides.
Yeah, the classic PowerPoint.
Exactly. But they withhold actual messy responsibility from the learners.
They'll discuss outreach endlessly in these sterile committee meetings, but never actually walk down the street to practice it.
Because there is an obsession with growth, but it's completely isolated from the environments where it will actually be tested.
You know, this reminds me so much of corporate technical debt.
Oh, that's an interesting connection. How so?
Well, it's that phenomenon where a startup gets so obsessed with building the perfect internal HR tools, the perfect communication channels, the mission statements.
Right, the scaffolding.
Exactly. They spend like 90% of their energy on internal scaffolding and 10% actually building the product for the customer.
Yeah, they bankrupt themselves, optimizing for internal safety.
Exactly. So are we essentially looking at institutions that are creating fragile believers or fragile employees who only know how to consume information but just shatter upon contact with reality?
That is precisely the mechanism at play. And this condition is diagnosed in the text as inward Christianity.
Inward Christianity.
Right. What happens sociologically is that an institution's energy slowly, almost imperceptibly, curves inward.
Like a black hole.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
The strongest, most passionate conversations stop being about the outside world.
Right.
And they start revolving entirely around internal maintenance. Budgets, building campaigns, internal programs, schedule coordination.
Which means the best volunteers, the most dedicated people become completely exhausted.
Just keeping the machinery running.
Yeah. And in the middle of all this frantic internal activity, the actual lost, the people the institution was originally designed to reach, they completely vanish from the organization's imagination.
The external mission becomes this theoretical hobby.
While the internal maintenance becomes the actual religion.
Exactly. Now, the framework uses a very specific theological term here to combat this inward drift.
And this is a concept we really need to dig into.
It asserts that true belief requires embodiment, because the message isn't just a philosophy, it's an incarnational reality.
Incarnational, that is the philosophical bedrock of this entire approach, isn't it?
It is. The term incarnational points to the theological premise that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us.
Right.
The underlying logic is that God did not attempt to save the world by dropping a textbook from the sky.
Or giving an abstract lecture.
Right. The divine actually entered the human condition, taking on the dirt, the suffering, the physical limitations of a neighborhood.
So therefore, if the message is going to maintain its integrity, it cannot remain a theoretical philosophy.
It must take on flesh. It has to become visible in the physical actions, the mercy, and the bodily presence of the people carrying it.
Okay, that makes profound logical sense within this framework, but it really forces a difficult question.
What's that?
Well, if this incarnational, action-oriented, flesh and blood approach is so central to the core identity of the movement,
Right.
why do these institutions fall so consistently into the greenhouse trap? Like, why is the pull inward so gravitational?
If you look at the psychological underpinnings, the answer is remarkably human.
Which is?
The greenhouse is simply safer.
Safety.
Yeah. Theoretical learning protects people from the profound vulnerability of embarrassment.
That makes a lot of sense.
It protects leaders from the messiness of public failure. If you keep your training inside the classroom, you control all the variables.
You can guarantee the presentation looks flawless.
Exactly. But stepping into the real world, into a neighborhood that doesn't care about your internal jargon.
That invites rejection.
Rejection, misunderstanding, severe awkwardness.
So by prioritizing this emotional and institutional safety, they ultimately produce spectators instead of servants.
Exactly. They create a culture where people are highly trained at critiquing the ministry, evaluating the sermon, judging the music.
But they have absolutely no idea how to actually execute the mission themselves.
Right. They become consumers of a religious product rather than participants in a mission.
And breaking out of that consumer mindset requires a complete architectural overhaul.
A total overhaul of how the institution views its purpose.
Which brings us to the architectural blueprint. If the greenhouse is the problem, how do you break the glass?
The framework transitions to a foundational strategy using a very specific historical map.
And it doesn't rely on modern corporate strategy, does it?
Not at all. It goes back to a single sentence spoken by Jesus right before his ascension, recorded in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 8.
And the author doesn't treat this as just a poetic farewell.
No, it is dissected as a complete, scalable operational map for human and institutional movement.
Okay, the quote is, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth."
The author spends a massive amount of time breaking this down.
starting with two absolute prerequisites that have to happen before anyone takes a single step outward.
Right. The first prerequisite is power before strategy.
Power before strategy. This is a direct challenge to the modern operational mindset.
Oh, totally. Because institutions today are inherently obsessed with metrics.
Right. They want to measure attendance, track flyer distribution, optimize social media reach.
It's a spreadsheet mentality.
Yeah.
But the argument here is that strategy without spiritual power,
Right.
human effort without divine efficacy, is fundamentally insufficient.
It's like the difference between building a beautiful sailboat and actually having wind in the sails.
Oh, that's a great way to visualize it.
I mean, you can have the best rigging in the world, the most perfectly polished deck, but if there's no wind, you are just sitting in the water admiring your own boat.
Exactly. You can organize events perfectly, but without that underlying power, the mission devolves into an exhausting, purely human performance.
It requires a psychological surrender of control.
You have to learn to depend on something outside your own strategic brilliance before you act.
And then the second prerequisite is witness before prestige.
Yes.
This distinction completely reframed how I think about communication. A witness is not a performer.
No, they aren't.
A witness is not a marketer trying to invent a clever, focus-grouped religious brand.
Right. Legally and practically, a witness is simply someone who takes the stand and testifies to what they have actually seen, heard, and experienced.
Nothing more, nothing less.
The framework draws a sharp, unforgiving line between seeking visibility for oneself, which is the pursuit of prestige, versus seeking visibility for the message.
Which is the active witness.
Yes, and the psychological drivers behind those two things are totally opposed.
How so?
Well, prestige needs applause. Witness just needs faithfulness. Prestige is obsessed with protecting reputation. Witness accepts the possibility of suffering or being misunderstood.
Which completely removes the pressure to sound clever, to have all the philosophical answers, or to be a polished presenter.
You are simply required to be honest about what you've encountered.
Which is incredibly liberating for the person paralyzed in the greenhouse. You don't have to be a theologian. You just have to be a witness.
Exactly. Once those prerequisites are established, power over strategy, witness over prestige, the blueprint moves into the geography of mission.
Mapping out 4 expanding circles of engagement. Let's explore these circles, because the psychological implications of this geography apply to so much more than ancient borders.
They really do.
The first circle is Jerusalem. In this framework, Jerusalem represents the familiar and the immediate.
It's your home base, your immediate neighborhood, your family, your workplace, your dorm room.
And the insistence here is that mission must begin with proximity.
You cannot dream of having a massive distant impact if you are willfully neglecting the people right at your own doorstep.
Right. It prevents that kind of romanticized escapism where someone wants to go change the world but refuses to speak to their own neighbor.
Yeah, if you can't be a witness in your own break room, you have no business trying to be one across the globe.
You haven't built the muscle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then the circle expands to the second stage, which is Judea.
Judea represents the surrounding region.
Culturally and sociologically, these are the communities that are connected to you but not identical to you.
It's the neighboring town, the different socioeconomic demographic just across the highway.
It is close enough to be recognizable, but far enough away that it requires intentional, deliberate movement to get there.
It pushes the individual just outside their comfortable social ease.
Yes, but here's where it gets really interesting. The third circle is Samaria.
Right. And the author makes it abundantly clear that Samaria isn't just a coordinate on a map that happens to be further away.
Not at all.
It is a psychologically fraught, historically hostile, deeply uncomfortable territory.
To understand the weight of Samaria, you really have to look at the historical context.
Okay, unpack that for us.
In the biblical imagination of that time, Samaria represented profound tension, deep estrangement, and centuries of historical hostility.
So it wasn't just a physical journey, it was an emotional one.
Huge. Entering Samaria meant confronting deep-seated prejudices, intense ethnic tension, and profound social discomfort.
It was the place that the original audience would instinctively want to avoid at all costs.
Exactly, which makes it such a powerful metaphor.
Let's bridge this to our modern reality. For a listener working in a corporate tech environment, their Samaria might be that legacy sales department they despise and constantly war with.
Right.
Or for a political activist, Samaria is the neighborhood that overwhelmingly voted for the opposing party.
Yes. It's the place where you assume you will be rejected before you even open your mouth, because the historical baggage is so heavy.
So why does this framework insist that a community that never enters its Samaria is failing its mandate?
Because it is the ultimate test of the message's universality.
Oh, it's good.
If a community only serves and engages with people who resemble them, people who share their exact values, income bracket, and aesthetic, then they are not fulfilling a divine mandate.
They're just running a localized cultural club.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Growth, both for the individual's character and the movement's integrity, only happens when you step out of the demographic echo chamber.
It proves that the love you were talking about in the greenhouse actually functions out in the hostile elements.
Precisely. Samaria forces the group to cross lines of prejudice and distance. It breaks tribalism.
And once you have learned to navigate the hostility of Samaria without losing your capacity to love, you are prepared for the final circle.
The ends of the earth.
The global horizon.
Yeah.
Cultivating a global imagination and realizing the mission is larger than your own national or cultural preferences.
Yeah.
So we have the map. We know the greenhouse is a trap. We know we have to rely on power and witness. And we know we have to eventually cross those terrifying borders into Samaria. But that brings up a massive operational problem. How do you actually train a terrified, fragile person to do that?
Because you can't just hand the map and say, good luck in hostile territory.
Exactly. And this is where the genius of the manual really shines, because it transitions from the theoretical what to the highly practical how.
It outlines a 5-step rhythm of hands-on discipleship.
Dissecting how Jesus actually trained his followers, presenting it as the ultimate, universally applicable apprenticeship program.
Let's dig deep into this 5-step rhythm, because whether you are training a new manager, teaching a kid to drive, or trying to mobilize a volunteer, these steps are profoundly human.
Okay, step 1 is simply model it.
So the underlying psychology of modeling is that instruction alone is insufficient for complex human behavior.
Instruction says, here's a list of things you should do.
But modeling says, here is what it actually looks, sounds, and feels like when it is done in real time.
There's a massive cognitive difference there.
Huge. You could deliver a brilliant 45-minute lecture on the theology of generosity.
But modeling is when the apprentice watches you quietly give up your afternoon off to help a stranded neighbor when you are visibly exhausted.
Right. And there's a crucial point made here about the nature of the person doing the modeling.
Yes, the transparency.
It requires transparency, not perfection.
Which is a huge relief for anyone in leadership.
Oh, totally. If modeling required flawless execution, if you had to be sinless and perfectly poised, no one could ever teach.
What the learner actually needs is a faithful, transparent person.
They need to see a mentor who makes a mistake, confesses when they are wrong, repents, and keeps showing up.
That kind of visibility makes the concept of grace tangible.
It proves to the apprentice that maturity isn't about instant perfection. It's a pattern of daily surrender and resilience.
And that transparency naturally bridges into step 2, which is do it together.
The author calls this the theology of companionship.
The core argument being that ministry, or any deeply meaningful work, is communal before it is individual.
Because shared proximity transforms fear into confidence.
Fear survives and thrives in the absence of experience.
Exactly. A new learner might be absolutely paralyzed by the idea of saying the wrong thing to someone in crisis.
But if they are invited into the process alongside a mature mentor, the dynamic changes.
They are no longer performing alone on a stage. They are participating in a shared reality.
There is a story in the text that beautifully illustrates the mechanics of this. It's about a young woman named Anna.
This is a great example.
Anna had been attending her church for years, soaking up all the information in the greenhouse. But she felt entirely unqualified to do something like a hospital visitation.
She assumed that kind of intimate outreach was reserved for highly confident professional Christians who had special theological training.
Right. She was terrified she would sound awkward or that she wouldn't know how to answer someone asking why they were suffering.
And notice how the mentor intervenes here. The mentor does not hand Anna a pamphlet on how to talk to the sick.
They don't send her to a 6-week seminar.
No. The mentor simply says, "Come with me."
And Anna is invited just to observe. She watches as the mentor enters the hospital room, and what she sees fundamentally alters her perception.
Because the mentor doesn't put on a flashy, super spiritual performance.
They don't offer complex theological answers to the patient's pain.
Right. The mentor just enters gently, asks permission to sit down, listens for 20 minutes while only speaking for 2, asks permission to pray a very simple prayer, and leaves.
The observation demystifies the entire process.
It shatters the illusion that ministry is an elite performance. Anna realizes that true engagement is quiet, steady, and profoundly human.
And eventually, during one of these shared visits, the mentor asks Anna if she would like to pray the closing prayer.
Right. And her voice trembles. It's not a perfectly polished monologue, but she does it.
And she realizes she didn't shatter.
The shared presence completely broke her spell of passivity.
It healed her hidden wounds of inadequacy. But, we have to acknowledge the friction here.
Yeah, what's the friction?
Because as beautiful as that story is, I want to push back on the reality of actually implementing this.
Okay, let's be realistic.
In a modern organization, whether it's a corporate office evaluated on quarterly growth or a church evaluated on weekly attendance and program output, who actually has the time to do this?
Right. To spend weeks or months slowly bringing one person along.
Letting them observe, letting them stumble through a prayer. Every manager and leader is thinking, it is 10 times faster and more efficient if I just do the hospital visit myself.
It is entirely counterintuitive to the modern efficiency model.
This slow mentoring sounds commercially and institutionally suicidal.
And the author explicitly acknowledges this tension.
Yeah.
If your ultimate goal is speed and efficiency, then yes, do it yourself. But if you look at the underlying logic of the framework, the argument is that the kingdom, or any enduring movement, grows through reproduction, not efficiency.
Reproduction versus efficiency. That is the core trade-off.
Yes, if you optimize for efficiency, you create an immediate bottleneck.
You might get the task done perfectly today, but you are the only one who can do it tomorrow.
You become the ceiling of your organization's capacity.
Wow.
But if you optimize for reproduction, you endure the agonizing slowness of the process. You endure the clumsiness of the learner.
You sacrifice short-term speed, but you ultimately multiply the workforce.
You are trading the dopamine hit of crossing something off your to-do list for the generational impact of building a capable human being.
Okay, so Anna has observed. She has participated in a shared, protected way, but there's a danger here.
What's that?
If the mentor never steps back, Anna just becomes a permanent assistant. She never actually owns the conviction.
Right.
How does the mentor get out of the way without letting her crash and burn? This moves us to the final 3 steps of the rhythm. Try, reflect, and release.
Step 3 is let them try. At some critical juncture, observation and shared participation are no longer enough.
The learner has to take the reins.
And this is the moment where institutions usually panic, because it feels vastly safer to keep the actual responsibility in the hands of the vetted experts.
The danger of overprotection. The author makes a really sharp distinction here to help leaders navigate this anxiety. They separate destructive failure from formative failure.
And understanding that difference is vital for any healthy culture.
Let's define them.
Destructive failure is rooted in arrogance, gross negligence, abuse of power, or a reckless disregard for truth and people.
Right. No organization should encourage or casually tolerate destructive failure.
Exactly. But formative failure is completely different.
Formative failure is what happens when someone is sincerely trying to obey, sincerely trying to execute the mission, but they simply haven't developed the skill, the timing, or the emotional regulation yet.
It's clumsy obedience.
Clumsy obedience, I like that.
It's the toddler falling over while learning to walk. The framework insists that grace is explicitly for learners.
If a community never allows for formative failure, it never truly trains anyone. It merely manages them.
You have to let them try, knowing they will likely stumble.
But you can't just let them try, watch them stumble, and walk away.
No, because experience alone does not automatically translate into wisdom.
People can have 20 years of experience, but if it's just the same 1 year of bad experience repeated 20 times, they haven't learned anything.
Which brings us to step 4, review and reflect.
Without a structured reflection phase, people might stay incredibly busy, they might repeat behaviors, but they won't understand the mechanisms behind their own actions.
The manual provides 4 highly specific diagnostic questions for this debriefing phase, and they are brilliant.
Let's walk through these 4 questions. First, what happened?
This sounds basic, but it's crucial. You just want the facts of the event.
Right.
Because a learner who is insecure will often distort the memory of the event, catastrophizing a minor awkward moment into a massive failure.
Establishing the objective facts grounds the reflection.
Exactly.
Second question, what worked?
This trains the apprentice to recognize where genuine connection or grace actually occurred.
It forces them to look for the positive anomalies, even in a difficult interaction.
Right.
Third, where did fear interfere? This is such a compassionate way to phrase it.
Is deeply compassionate. It doesn't ask, why did you mess up? It asks, where did fear interfere?
It externalizes the fear.
Yes, allowing the mentor and apprentice to look at it objectively.
Mhm.
It names the hesitation without shaming the learner's character.
And the fourth question, where did grace become visible?
This is about training the spiritual eye. It's
Uh-huh.
teaching the learner to see the small, seeming insignificant moments as profound victories.
Like a softening of a tone, a moment of shared silence, a defensive posture dropping.
Exactly.
There is a story about a young guy named Daniel that perfectly captures why this reflection phase is the linchpin of the whole process.
Let's hear it.
Daniel was volunteering at a food outreach program for the very first time. He was naturally introverted, incredibly nervous, and after the event, he felt like a total failure.
Why did he feel like a failure?
He felt he was too quiet, that he didn't deliver the right theological insights to the people he was serving.
Ah, I see. If the process had stopped there, Daniel would have internalized that failure, retreated to the greenhouse, and never volunteered again.
But the mentor sat down with him to review and reflect. During the debrief, the mentor asked those questions.
And what did Daniel say?
He admitted he felt guilty for not talking more, but he noticed that one struggling woman he was sitting with seemed visibly relieved when he finally stopped trying to offer solutions and just asked her how her week was.
Wow. The reflection fundamentally rewrote Daniel's narrative.
Exactly. The mentor helped Daniel realize that his quietness, his willingness to just listen without preaching, wasn't a failure at all.
It was exactly what was needed.
For a woman who is constantly talked down to by social services, government agencies, and aggressive people on the street, Daniel's quiet, respectful listening was exactly the compassionate presence she needed.
The reflection converted his clumsy experience into deep wisdom.
Which prepares the learner for the ultimate final threshold, release. Step 5.
The text illustrates this with a woman named Liza.
Okay, tell us about Liza.
Liza had spent a year in this rhythm. She watched, she co-led, she tried, she reflected.
She put in the work.
She really did. Then one day, her mentor asked her to organize and lead an outreach conversation entirely on her own.
And how did it go?
Well, the manual is wonderfully honest. It doesn't claim the night was a flawless success.
Of course not.
The schedule shifted, some conversations were undeniably awkward, but Liza didn't panic.
She listened, she adapted, she relied on the power she learned about in step 1, and she navigated it.
She realized she no longer needed a proxy. She no longer needed someone else to speak for her.
She was finally learning to speak from her own internalized conviction.
That is the ultimate goal of human formation. Mature freedom and agency, not perpetual dependency on a charismatic leader.
But let me challenge the psychology of this release step.
Go for it.
Isn't releasing someone just a polite way of abandoning them? If I'm the mentor and I've spent a year pouring my life, my time, and my emotional energy into Liza, and then I just step back and say you're released, aren't I leaving her without a safety net?
Doesn't that feel cold?
Yeah, it feels a bit cold.
It only feels cold if you view discipleship as a hierarchy of control.
Oh, interesting.
If you look at the underlying logic of the framework, release is absolutely not abandonment. The mentor doesn't vanish into thin air.
So what changes?
The fundamental nature of the relationship shifts. The mentor transitions from being a supervisor, a director, or a manager to becoming a peer, a fellow worker, an encourager.
The scaffolding comes down because the building can stand on its own.
Exactly. There is a phrase used here that is incredibly poignant. The deepest love does not cling forever. It equips and blesses.
The deepest love does not cling forever. That's powerful.
The argument is that a mentor who refuses to release a disciple, who constantly needs to be needed, is confusing true mentorship with codependency.
True leadership is ultimately about making yourself obsolete.
Wow. Making yourself obsolete, that is a hard pill to swallow for anyone with an ego.
Okay, so we have a fully trained disciple. Liza has been modeled to, she has tried, she has reflected, and she is released.
She is out of the greenhouse.
But now she hits a massive external wall. She's standing in her Samaria.
Right, the hostile territory.
How does she actually communicate this deeply held truth to people who don't share her worldview, her vocabulary, or her baseline assumptions about reality?
This brings us to the entire section on cultural awareness and the critical necessity of translating meaning, not just words.
The framework outlines guidelines for what it calls faithful and fitting contextual evangelism.
And the theological premise here is an interesting tightrope. It asserts that the core message, the gospel, is eternal, unchanging, and fixed.
But the methods of delivering it, the packaging, must be highly contextual and endlessly adaptable.
It is a fierce warning against generic ministry.
Generic ministry, what does that look like?
Well, generic ministry operates on the lazy assumption that all human communities are essentially the same.
It assumes that a program that worked in a wealthy suburban neighborhood in 1995 will automatically work in a dense, diverse urban center today.
Right. To combat this, the author points to the historical example of Paul in Athens, found in Acts 17.
And treats it as an absolute masterclass in cultural translation.
It is the perfect case study. Athens was not Jerusalem. It was the intellectual and cultural epicenter of the Greek world, utterly saturated with secular philosophy and competing idolatries.
It was a completely alien worldview to Paul.
And his approach is fascinating. He doesn't just kick open the city gates, stand on a soapbox, and start shouting condemnations at them in a language they don't understand.
No, the framework breaks his methodology into three distinct sequential actions. First, he observes.
He doesn't speak immediately. He walks through the city, he looks at their architecture, he examines their altars.
He pays close attention to what this culture actually values and fears.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, he connects.
He doesn't start with how wrong they are.
No, he actually quotes their own secular poets and philosophers to demonstrate that he has taken the time to understand their intellectual framework.
He finds an altar dedicated to an unknown god, and instead of smashing it, he uses it as his conversational bridge.
He validates their inherent search for meaning before he introduces his own.
And only after observing and connecting, building that bridge of mutual respect, does he move to the third action, which is he confronts.
He doesn't water down his message. He speaks the difficult truth very clearly, ultimately calling for a radical change in their thinking.
The lesson here is that contextualization isn't about compromising your core convictions or avoiding hard truths to be popular.
It is about doing the hard work of finding the right vocabulary and the right entry points so that the hard truth can actually be comprehended rather than just dismissed as alien noise.
To help modern individuals do what Paul did in Athens, the manual outlines 5 specific layers of community understanding.
It's basically a cultural diagnostic tool.
And honestly, this is where the deep dive gets incredibly practical for anyone trying to understand a new group of people.
Let's dig into these 5 layers and the mechanics of how they work. The first layer is language.
And we have to be clear, this doesn't just mean translating English to Spanish.
Right. It means understanding the semantic domain of a community. What are their metaphors? What are the shared stories they reference?
What specific phrases carry heavy emotional weight?
If a church uses heavy theological jargon words like sanctification, atonement, or fellowship, in a secular neighborhood, they aren't communicating.
They are just making noise.
Exactly. It triggers an outgroup alarm. The cognitive load required for the listener to translate that jargon is too high, so they just tune it out.
The second layer is values. You have to observe how the community defines the good life.
Does this specific neighborhood prioritize collective identity and extended family loyalty? Or do they value hyper-individualism and personal career success?
If your message assumes individualism in a community that values the collective, your entire premise will fall flat.
The third layer is wounds. This one hit me hard.
We aren't just looking at what people value, we are looking at where they have been broken.
Because pain is often the loudest voice in any community's history.
Wounds can be historical injustices, the collapse of a local industry, or deep relational breakdowns caused by previous institutions.
The mechanism here is defensive skepticism.
Right. If a community has been historically wounded by outside organizations, say a series of corrupt city governments or predatory businesses, their baseline psychological state is defensive.
Any new initiative, no matter how pure its motives, is immediately viewed as a threat.
It's like trying to pet a rescue dog. If you just reach your hand out enthusiastically, it bites you.
Not because it hates you, but because the last 3 hands that reached out hit it.
If you ignore the historical wounds, your outreach will be perceived as aggression.
That is a perfect analogy. You have to read the wounds to approach with the right posture. The fourth layer is rhythms.
What are the actual physical daily patterns of this community?
When do people organically gather? Where do they spend their time? Who controls the schedule?
And there is a story in the text that beautifully and somewhat tragically illustrates what happens when you ignore rhythms.
It's about a church trying to reach a community composed entirely of factory workers and fishermen.
This perfectly highlights the danger of the generic copy-paste ministry we talked about earlier.
The church decides they want to serve these workers, So they do what churches normally do,
They set up evening classes, formal programs at 7 p.m. inside their building.
and it failed completely. Attendance was absolute zero.
Now, the easy, psychologically protective narrative for the church would be to say, well, these fishermen are just stubborn.
They are hostile to the truth. Our culture is just too secular.
It protects their ego to blame the community.
Exactly. But thankfully, they stopped and started observing the rhythms.
They realized these men were working grueling physical shifts. By 7 p.m., they were completely exhausted, eating dinner and going to sleep.
But early in the morning, around 4:30 a.m. before sunrise, they all organically gathered down at the shore to drink coffee, repair nets, and prep their boats for the day.
The rhythm of the community was dictated by the tide, not by the church's programmatic clock.
So the church scrapped their expensive evening classes, they bought a bunch of coffee, showed up at the shore at dawn, and just started pouring cups and building relationships in the freezing cold.
And it worked. The barriers came down.
That specific story leads to what I think is the most critical, paradigm-shifting quote in the entire manual.
What is it?
Irrelevance is often mistaken for rejection.
Wow, let that sink in. Irrelevance is mistaken for reject.
The fishermen never rejected the core message of the church. They rejected a completely irrelevant delivery method that ignored the brutal reality of their exhausted lives.
If an institution ignores the rhythms or the wounds of a community, its message won't sound like good news.
It will sound like a tone-deaf demand on their already depleted energy.
Contextualization, the author argues, isn't about marketing. It is ultimately an act of translation, which is the highest form of respect and love.
Just to round out the 5 layers, the final one is fears.
What threatens their sense of security? Is it a fear of economic failure? Fear of social rejection? Fear of meaninglessness?
Because fear usually reveals what a community ultimately trusts. If you know what they are terrified of losing, you know what they have built their identity upon.
So if we need to understand language, values, wounds, rhythms, and fears, how do we systematically gather all this cultural intelligence?
We can't just guess.
The manual provides a specific, actionable tool for this, which is community mapping.
We are shifting from looking at Google Maps to exercising deep spiritual and sociological discernment.
This concept of mapping changes the fundamental question an organization asks.
The default greenhouse question is, how do we aggressively market ourselves so people come into our space, into our building on our terms?
Community mapping flips that entirely. It asks, where is God, or where is the good, the redemptive, the life-giving energy already at work out there in their spaces, and how can we join it?
This raises an important question about posture. How does mapping actually change the way a person interacts with their city on a Tuesday afternoon?
The author ties this back to that core concept of incarnational faith. It insists on 2 rules.
Presence must precede persuasion, and service must precede strategy.
To illustrate this posture, the text leans on the famous parable of the Good Samaritan.
Which is a story everyone knows, but usually just as a generic morality tale about being nice.
Right, but look at the mechanics of what the Samaritan actually does. He is walking on a dangerous road. He sees a wounded man.
He does not pass by and pass the bleeding man a perfectly written theological pamphlet about the problem of suffering.
He doesn't shout a sermon from a safe distance.
He stops his journey, he pays attention, he crosses the street, entering the danger zone.
He physically binds the wounds, using his own resources, and pays the financial cost of the man's care.
He maps the immediate pain and responds incarnationally.
Exactly. Mapping is about finding where the wounded actually are in your city and discovering where the organic networks of care already exist.
The manual gives really profound examples of how this mapping changes your daily perception.
When you start mapping a community's values and rhythms, a local middle school isn't just a brick building that causes traffic jams anymore.
You realize it is the primary place of identity formation for the next generation of your city.
A local farmer's market isn't just a place to buy expensive tomatoes. It becomes a dense, intersecting relational network.
The framework urges people to use this mapping to identify the trusted voices.
These usually aren't the politicians or the official CEOs. They are the informal leaders.
The grandmother who watches everyone's kids on the block, the barber who knows everyone's secrets, the local business owner who extends credit to struggling families.
You map the community to find where trust already flows.
But doing this right, mapping the wounds, learning the rhythms, finding the trusted voices, it requires an immense, almost agonizing amount of patience.
I keep thinking of an analogy here. It feels like this framework is demanding that we become gardeners when our entire modern culture is obsessed with fireworks.
That is a phenomenal contrast. Let's explore that.
Fireworks are easy. You buy them, you light a fuse, they're incredibly loud, they are bright, and they immediately capture the attention of everyone in a 5-mile radius.
But it lasts for exactly 6 seconds, leaves a bunch of toxic smoke, and then it's over. Nothing grew.
A garden, on the other hand, takes months of quiet, unglamorous, back-breaking work in the dirt.
You are pulling weeds, you are mapping the soil quality, you are waiting on the rain.
Nobody applauds you while you're planting seeds, but eventually the garden is what actually sustains life.
That analogy perfectly captures the text's severe warning against event-centered religion, or event-centered organizations.
The author explicitly states that events say, come and see our performance, but incarnational relationships say, walk with me through life.
Events are the fireworks. Relationships are the garden.
It's the difference between hosting a massive block party once a year and actually knowing the names of the people on your block the other 364 days.
The culminating argument is that embodied witness means living the reality of the message visibly, quietly, and consistently in ordinary life.
It's about being present so faithfully that the secular community can actually read the truth of the church through the physical lives of its members.
The world is rarely watching to see if your theology is perfectly formulated.
They are watching to see if your message produces genuine compassion, deep integrity, and unshakable hope in the messy, wound-filled reality of the streets.
Okay, let's pull all of these threads together. We have gone on an incredibly deep journey through this manual today.
To you, the listener, whether you are analyzing this strictly from a theological perspective or whether you are simply a leader looking at the raw mechanics of human transformation, the core synthesis of this material is undeniable.
True transformation, moving any grand idea from a sterile theory into a living reality, requires stepping completely out of the safe, emotionally controlled greenhouse.
We've traced that required movement through the expanding circles of the Acts 1.8 blueprint, realizing that we cannot avoid the psychological discomfort of our own Samaria.
We've seen it in the rigorous, deeply patient 5-step apprenticeship model that forces mentors to abandon efficiency in order to move a learner from merely watching to clumsy trying to honest reflection and finally to complete release.
And we've seen it in the deep empathetic translation required for cultural mapping. Understanding the wounds, the fears, and the daily rhythms of a people before you ever open your mouth to persuade them.
The ultimate unshakable takeaway from this deep dive is that knowledge, no matter how precise, no matter how perfectly articulated in a classroom, must take on flesh through action.
It must become incarnational.
It is a comprehensive roadmap for moving from an informed, heavily credentialed spectator to an actually engaged, bleeding participant.
And this framework applies to literally any area of your life where you feel stuck in learning mode. You cannot just read about the fluid dynamics of the water.
You have to find someone willing to model the stroke.
You have to get in the freezing pool with them. You have to dare to splash around clumsily and experience formative failure.
You have to sit on the edge of the pool and reflect honestly on why you sank.
And eventually you have to swim out into the deep water on your own convictions.
The theory only becomes real in the water.
Exactly. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week, building on what I think was the most striking insight we uncovered today.
The author warns that irrelevance is often mistaken for rejection.
I want you to think about a specific place in your life right now. Maybe it's a fractured relationship with a family member, an incredibly stubborn workplace dynamic with another department, or a project you're desperately trying to launch that just isn't landing.
Think about a place where you feel like you are facing total hostile rejection.
What if you aren't actually being rejected? What if you are simply speaking a language they haven't learned yet?
What if you were enthusiastically reaching out to pet them, completely ignoring the historical wounds they carry from whoever sat in your chair before you?
What if you are trying to reach them with brilliant evening classes at a time of day when they are simply too exhausted to listen?
Maybe it is time to stop talking.
Step out of your comfortable greenhouse and start mapping the rhythms of their shores.